Another African-American man has been shot by a white police officer. The gruesome scene has triggered yet another round of protests in cities across the U.S. In this edition of the debate, we will look at how these incidents are taking the U.S. and its citizens over the edge, where hatred and violence between whites and African-Americans, not just against police officers, is becoming part of everyday life until the issue is dealt with seriously and a solution is found.
America is once again swept by protests against police brutality and racism. National Guards have now been deployed to the cities of Kenosha and Minneapolis to crack down on protests sparked by the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin last week. The tension has also sharpened the political divide as the presidential debate heats up in the country. President Donald Trump has tried to cash in on the unrest. He has emphasized that the upcoming presidential election is a choice between his law and order or the lawlessness of his Democratic challenger, Joe Biden. Biden has, however, condemned the systematic racism of the U.S. police.
Put yourself in the shoes of every black father and black mother in this country and ask, is this what we want America to be? Is this the country we should be? So let's unite and heal, do justice, end the violence, and end systemic racism in this country now.
On Tuesday, 2 people were shot dead and another was wounded by a white teenager. Police say the 17-year-old shooter, who seemed to be a member of a militia group, quote, took the law into his own hands and opened fire on protesters. The incident has further fueled anti-racism sentiments in the country. Footage captured at the scene shows police officers drive past the armed vigilante as the crowd were yelling for him to be arrested. Experts believe the killings would not have happened if the police had taken action against vigilantes.
The police are on the ground working with white supremacists and vigilante groups. One just recently, they killed 2 protesters with the cooperation of the police. And so it's not about training or anything like that. This is actually coming to a boiling point, the race-class divide that's inherent in the United States system.
Without mentioning the killing of protesters by an apparent white supremacist, Trump said he would deploy more federal troops in Kenosha to quell what he called looting and destruction. National Guards have also been stationed in the protest-hit city of Minneapolis, where officials have imposed a curfew. The city has been the epicenter of anti-racism protests following the police killing of unarmed African-American George Floyd in May. After the brutal murder of Floyd by a white officer and the following global outrage at the U.S. police brutality and racial discrimination, no one would have thought of another such incident at such a short interval. But just 3 months on, unarmed Jacob Blake is shot 7 times in the back right in front of his children, sparking yet another wave of protests and condemnation.
Joining us for this debate, we have human rights lawyer and activist Daniel Kovalik, who joins us from Pittsburgh. Daniel, welcome. Let's talk about what has occurred here, the crime itself. A man getting into a car, an African-American man, and a white police officer shooting him at the back 7 times. It has resulted in his paralysis, and of course his life is obviously in danger in that respect. What do you think about the way this crime went down?
Well, I mean, it's really unfathomable. First of all, it's pretty clear that the victim here hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't even wanted. Apparently, he had been trying to mediate a dispute between 2 other people. The cops were called to the scene. This guy tries to get into his car, and the cop shoots him in the back, as you say, 7 times. There's no evidence that he was fighting back or that he was a threat to anybody. It's really incredible. There was no justification or excuse for what this policeman did. You know, it's not clear why he did what he did, except that he had, you know, some racial animus towards this guy. I mean, it really was a pretty clear case of police misconduct, serious police misconduct.
Okay, let me bring in Jack Rice. He's a former prosecutor and criminal defense lawyer who joins us from Minneapolis. Jack Rice, welcome. Let me also ask you what your impression is of how this crime went down when you have a white police officer shooting an African-American man in the back 7 times, which has resulted in his paralysis and also for his life.
Well, this is particularly brutal. I mean, what we have seen is this happen again and again and again. I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, about 10 blocks from where George Floyd was killed in the street as an officer put his knee on his neck until he died. And so I'm very familiar with that case, but there are cases across the country in the United States that have seen this thing happen again and again and again. And here's the only difference. The difference is that nobody had cell phones decades ago. People have been making these claims for decades and nothing was happening and police officers would deny. And now that there are cell phones, it changes everything. To give you one simple hint, if we look at the George Floyd case, before the cell phones came out, the officers called in and said that Mr. Floyd was being disruptive and that they were fighting him, and that ultimately, as soon as he had any problems at all, they called for an ambulance. When the cell phones came out, it proved that, in fact, what happened was fundamentally different. This is consistent with what we have seen across the country. Look at what's happening in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right now, not far from where I am as well. A similar circumstance without a video. Do we think these officers would have said what, in fact, we all saw, or do you think we would see something else? I think I can tell you what that answer is.
Well, Daniel Kovalik, we're looking at a number of high-profile incidents that have happened now throughout the years, and of course these types of incidents to have occurred over the decades. The most recent one being the George Floyd incident, which obviously led to these massive protests not only within the U.S. but also outside of the U.S. around the world. Don't you think that each one of these incidents perhaps was also in a way a chance for authorities to try to fix this problem, or the people in charge or the politicians? Do you think that with all these incidents have amassed to the point that it is now, that whether this problem was addressed, if you can tell us what the failures are, what the shortcomings are here?
Well, I think there's a lot of failures here. I would certainly begin with starting at the top, as the Russians say, the fish rots at the head, and in this case the head is Donald Trump. And instead of trying to first of all bring calm, to try to tamp down on racial tensions, he has done nothing but tried to stoke the flames of racial tensions, in particular to stoke the flames of white supremacist hatred. Meanwhile, he hasn't been going to these cities to talk to anyone, to talk to protesters, to talk to the police and tell them, hey, you got to change your ways. I mean, as the commander-in-chief, as the president of the United States, what he does, what he says, could have a huge impact. And again, he has not even tried to bring the temperature down here. He has clearly tried to use the unrest that's happening to his advantage. And he's now running on a platform that somehow others are responsible for this unrest, vote for him, and he will stop it. Of course, he hasn't stopped yet. I mean, that is the irony here, right? They're showing photos of things happening right now under his presidency, and somehow he's saying if you vote for Biden, that's going to keep happening, right? So it's very strange, but he thinks this is going to work to his political advantage.
Jack Price, do you agree with our guest there?
I do, 100%. I mean, this is not new. I mean, that's really what's frustrating about this, is this is something that's been going on for centuries in the United States. And what we're seeing right now is in some ways worse, because at least what we saw from some in the past was lip service. But what we're seeing right now is a president who is, again, having 3 days of the Republican National Convention where he's actually exploiting it. What he's doing is he's calling for national unity, but specifically, really what he's calling for is not national unity at all. He's actually saying that what we have now is a need for law and order and to stop these people. The problem is that in itself, if you look at what he says, how he says it, the people he has supported in the past, including white supremacists, it's fundamentally racist from the top down. I can tell you from the perspective of a trial lawyer, I've had to stand in front of lots of juries and talk about race and talk about why it is that people look at people with different color skin and why they see them differently, how they see them differently, and what that means. To simply deny it, to simply say that it's not true, is fundamentally a lie. And the worst part is it actually exacerbates the situation. Hence, we had that 17-year-old young man in Kenosha who killed 2 people, allegedly. And in fact, that may have been driven partially because the president had 2 people who were waving guns at a defenseless crowd in the past, and put them on the pedestal and had them speak at the Republican National Convention. This doesn't just happen in a vacuum. This is a disaster.
Okay, I'd like to see if we can draw a line, Daniel Kovalik, if we can, about what the U.S. president is doing in terms of stoking the flames. Or is there a chance here that what he is doing is bringing out what people actually feel inside of themselves when it comes to African Americans? Now, I'm wondering if this is an appropriate question, first of all, but I want to really find out. I mean, yes, based on what you've both said, Donald Trump is not helping the cause. Okay, we get it, we understand that. But are feelings being surfaced now from white people from within the states against African Americans that perhaps we haven't seen? And maybe this is what's happening, which adds another dimension to the whole problem?
Well, I think you're right in essence, and I think my colleague addressed this, that, you know, the problem of racism in America is as old as America, right? And this isn't anything new. But there's no question that Trump has unleashed these forces, these white supremacist forces, which have existed largely in the shadows, right? But he has encouraged them now to come out and to act out. And that is the dangerous thing. You know, now these white supremacists feel that they have support in the highest rank of the United States to act violently against people of color. They now see that as patriotic because that is what the message they're getting from Trump and his supporters and the people speaking at his convention. So again, it's not so much that he is, you know, creating feelings in these people that they didn't have before, but he is now making it clear they can act on these feelings and they can unleash the violence that they have wanted to perpetrate for a long time.
Okay, to expand a little bit more about Trump, Jack Rice, to get your reaction here. VP Pence said Trump is a law and order president during the RNC. And also what Trump has said, that, and this is on the third day of the RNC, he portrayed democratic cities as rife with violence and crime. If you can give me your reaction on those two.
Well, my response is if we're talking about cities as Republican or Democrat, that's ridiculous. These are citizens. These are Americans. They are not one or the other. And by the way, if you're walking down the street and get shot, you don't get shot as a Republican. You don't get shot as a Democrat. And ideally, if you're a police officer, you're not either of those things either. So it's critical that we recognize the point. I mean, let me give you an example of what I've seen in the real world. I had a client of mine, and we're in the middle of a trial, and she was Muslim. She was wearing hijab. And if I had a jury in front of me in the past, they would have been hesitant to say what they thought and what they felt about this. I had a potential juror, look at my client and say, she looks like a terrorist to me because she's wearing hijab. Now, this is not something I ever would have seen until this president took office. This is the same president who said there are good people and bad people on both sides in Charlottesville, Virginia, when there were white supremacists on one side. There's nothing good about that, and there's no way to shine that up. And your other guest has it dead on. What you can't do is you can't exploit an issue and help these people rise up and to actually act out. And that's the difference. It's not just that they're hating, because in fact, I'd like to know where the haters are. That actually works for me. But the problem is you're actually seeing them act out now and doing more than we have ever seen before. And this is actually expanding, not detracting. It's a terribly difficult situation that's starting to impact and ripple across the country right now.
Daniel Kovalik, the issue of the white supremacists is a really important one, and it's really quite alarming. A new study we had on our news that came out that said white supremacists and militias have widely infiltrated police across the United States. And this report was published by a former FBI special agent who has said that far-right groups have found their way into U.S. law enforcement agencies. This is dangerous, And if this is really what's happening, what kind of road are Americans going down on, and what's going to happen there out on the streets when you have this type of infiltration?
Well, it's quite frightening, and frankly, we're starting to see the effects of this. The FBI also recently, issued a statement saying that they now conclude the greatest domestic terror threat now is from white supremacist groups. And they're absolutely right. And this has been ignored for a long time. This has been true for a long time. But finally, the FBI has acknowledged it. Especially after 9/11, everyone was looking, for the foreign terrorist who was going to, commit some act of violence, when the people, by and large, creating terror in this country are homegrown white supremacists. And that has to be confronted and dealt with in a very systematic way. And again, sadly, instead you have a president who seems to be egging them on.
Jack Rice, this has now spread, aside from the protests, across all different domains in the United States. I'm looking down a list of some of the things that have happened. For example, in sports, where you have the NBA that was postponed. I think they actually came back on, but there were multiple playoff games that were postponed. You have the athletes protesting to this. You have this happening in different also sports like baseball and Major League Soccer. You have the protests, the racial injustice protests, being reflected in different venues at an accelerated pace. Does this mean that we're going to see more positivity coming out of this exposure, which highlights some of the things that need to be highlighted? Or do you think that this is the right way to go for this to be highlighted in the form and manner that it is?
Well, I see the positivity in that the more that people acknowledge the truth, the more important it is for this country. Because there are problems all over the world, and I've taught lawyers and judges and prosecutors all over the planet, and all countries struggle. But what we're talking about is a transparent society where the problems that we face, we acknowledge so we can address those problems. And if what we're seeing is more people acknowledge the fact that 30% of the United States are people of color, but they represent 2/3 of the people in prison. The idea that they're twice or 3 or 4 times more likely to be stopped. They're far more likely to be arrested. They're 4 or 5 times more likely to be have an officer use force against them. I mean, these are all issues that exist. Again, what I think has changed is if you go into communities of color, what you will find is they would acknowledge this and talk about this. And I've had clients for decades talk to me about driving while black and what that means, while they get stopped for literally doing nothing except for being black while they drive. And it's happened to them again and again and again and again. And so acknowledging that is a massive first step. Ideally, what you're going to see is that more people than just the people in those communities are willing to stand up and say, in any country, that this is unacceptable. If we're special, if we're a country that's worthy, then we stand up for all of our citizens, not just the ones that look a certain way. Right now, we are certainly not seeing that in certain parts of this country. No, most of this country. I think if we continue to move forward, there is positivity. And if that means that the NBA actually doesn't play because they say enough, and they have LeBron James said it very clearly. If you're seeing it with football, enough, fine. What we're seeing is Kaepernick saying the same thing. If we're seeing it in TV, if we're seeing it in the movies, if we're seeing it in other areas, great. I would like to see that too. Let's address what we're doing incorrectly, because that's the only way we actually improve as a country.
The idea of how this should be addressed is obviously a big question mark, I'm guessing, Daniel Kovalik. And I'm looking at the depth of the problem from the outside. When we take a look at, for example, the Portland protests, they just gathered for the 90th consecutive day, 90 days, 3 months after the death of George Floyd. And of course, you had the Black Lives Matter protests that are said to be one of the largest movements in U.S. history. Do you think that authorities and politicians, okay, we talked about Trump, but other politicians, U.S. politicians, or anybody else that has some kind of authority addressing the issue in the form and manner that it should, given the depth of the problem as it exists?
Well, I think there are some. I mean, I think I see some hopeful signs coming out of Seattle, for example, where first of all, they're trying to deal with some of the, socioeconomic problems that we see in this country, disparities that feed into this police violence by, for example, taxing companies like Amazon. And we see cities starting to vote to cut funding to police and to instead put that money into social programs to deal, again, with more systemic issues. So yeah, that gives me some hope. I think we are seeing that happen around the country. I think we could see that on the federal level, but sadly, probably not under this administration.
Which brings me to my final question to you, Jack Rice. Under Trump, were he to be reelected, would the problem be addressed and improve, or will it get worse? And under Biden, were he to be elected, would the problem get better?
My fear is that under President Trump, it would get worse because he continues to exploit this. From his perspective, it's all about creating wedge issues to drive his base. He doesn't care about who's on the bottom side of that wedge. He doesn't care what happens to those people. And I only say this based upon my past experience of what I've seen for the last 3.5 years. When I look at a Biden presidency, does it guarantee better? No. No, it doesn't, because in fact, we've seen Democrats fail over and over again. Many people were fine with just looking the other way, and they have for centuries. So would I like to see more? Yes. Am I hopeful? I'm always optimistic. But at the same time, I think there has to be constant pressure on whoever is in the White House, who's ever in the legislature, whether it's federally or in all 50 states, to try to address these issues, because this doesn't just happen out of nowhere. The frustration that we see in all of our cities doesn't come from ether. It comes from centuries of violence, centuries of decay, and that people are finally tired and they can't take it. And so it's important that we finally address and continue to address these issues, because it's not going to be fixed in a bumper sticker. It's not going to be fixed with one simple bill and say, okay, problem solved. That's not how this works. You mess up something for 200, 300, 400 years, you're not going to fix it in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for that. We're going to unfortunately have to end it there. Human rights lawyer and activist Daniel Kovalik, thank you for your comments. You were just listening to former prosecutor and criminal defense lawyer Jack Rice. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate from Mikhail Way. Entire team in the capital, Tehran. Goodbye.